Hi, I'm Ari Redbord.
And I'm Angela Ang.
Welcome to TRM Talks. TRM Talks is brought to you by TRM Labs, the leading provider of blockchain intelligence and anti-money laundering software.
Australia is home to a growing crypto ecosystem. A 2022 survey by the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, or AUSTRAC, found that crypto was the second most popular investment in Australia after shares. With this growth has come increasing regulatory attention. We started 2023 with a token mapping exercise by the Commonwealth Treasury, which, as the name implies, maps crypto assets to existing Australian legislation in order to decide how they should be regulated. Australia has also taken steps towards modernizing its AML-CTF regime by consulting on the implementation of reforms, including alignment to the latest FATF standards, such as the travel rule. And we saw developments in areas such as cybersecurity, tax, and financial crime enforcement, as well as a strong focus on consumer protection and fighting scams. So to say the least, 2023 has been a busy year for crypto asset policy in Australia, and we are excited to be joined by our panel of experts from Down Under to unpack these developments. Joining us today, we have Bradley Brown, Acting Deputy CEO for Regulation and Reform at AUSTRAC, Australia's Financial Intelligence Unit and AML-CTF Supervisor, Joni Pirovich, Principal at Blockchain and Digital Assets Services Plus Law and the founder of LawFi DAO, and Steve Vallas, Managing Director of Blockchain APAC. Great to have you here with us, guys.
It is awesome to have everyone on. G'day, mates. As they say, that's it. I know John O'Newman's going to be very upset with me, but there will be no Australian accent beyond that. But really excited, as you know, on this panel, we've been really wanting to do this for some time because, quite frankly, there is so much going on down under. So much so that I am not going to do sort of our usual tell us about your journey. I'm just going to kind of dig right in. But I would love it if you kind of would weave your journey and sort of what you're working on now into some of the answers today. Brad, kind of kicking things off with you. If you could provide sort of a little perspective for us here, right? There's been a lot going on, and Angela sort of dug in a little bit to this, what's been happening in the last year, 18 months, but really Australia's been working on this for a lot longer than that. Can you talk a little bit about the work AUSTRAC in particular has been doing?
Thanks very much, Ari, and thank you very much for the opportunity. I think context for the audience, digital currency exchanges, which is the current terminology that AUSTRAC uses, have been regulated by AUSTRAC since 2018, and I was certainly involved in that regulation at the time and involved with the industry in the years that preceded that in terms of where we were progressing in Australia to get the anti-money laundering regulation and the elements that surround that within that digital currency environment. So what AUSTRAC regulates for the audience is presently what we otherwise refer to as the on and off ramps, so where digital currency is exchanged for fiat currency and the reverse. So there's multiple other limbs or other parts of the international standard definition around virtual assets now, which many people on this call would be aware of. And some of that, as mentioned by Angela, is necessarily being considered within the broader modernisation of Australia's anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing regime. So, but just as a bit of an understanding, so as I said, we have registered or digital currency exchanges who provide those services must register with AUSTRAC. Presently, we have approximately 400 digital currency exchanges of varying sizes and various different product scopes registered with AUSTRAC. So that can range from large international firms that have presence in multiple different jurisdictions to individual businesses and sole operators within the Australian context. So that probably just gives a broad brush summary of where we are, and I think we're going to sort of cover off on different elements that we've seen. So I'll throw back to you, and if that's where we go next, happy to keep going.
No, that's a fantastic overview, and I think a good sort of entry point for Steve into this conversation. Really, the promise of crypto is cross-border value transfer at the speed of the internet, with cross-border really being kind of the operative word. Steve, you've done a lot of work sort of bringing voices together. some in Australia, some outside of Australia in other jurisdictions. Recently, you did a summit bringing sort of those types of voices together. Talk a little bit about that work and maybe some of the ways you're working cross-border, but then also public-private.
Sure. It's a tricky thing, Ari, because, I've been showing up since 2017, give or take. Jane and I met many years ago when we were probably more optimistic about how quickly this sort of technology and this conversation would take root. And so have kind of followed where the general thematics are going, and then largely locally trying to amplify what those conversations are, bringing what's happening internationally into the Australian jurisdiction. And where we find ourselves in 2023 is probably a more insular view than we've had in, say, 2021 and 2022. I think the external positivity around innovation and growth and economic opportunity was penetrating the local market. And I think what we're finding now is the local conversation, I wouldn't say mired, but it is very much dominated by concerns about retail, consumer protections, scams and scam narratives. And it's coming at the expense of some of the economic opportunity. And I think internationally, notwithstanding the fact that there are similar concerns, by weighting, they're not being expressed the same way. So when I ran that event, the Digital Asset Conference, what we tried to do largely is to bring businesses that have cross-border application of their business or their tech or aspire to move data packets all around the world quickly, and then just show again at closer quarters how those businesses are being built out. And that geography, and this is a challenge for those who have a startup mindset that's built in sort of a pre-digital native world, geography used to matter much more than it does now. Data packets and chips and processing speed and AI tell us it's just data packets around the world. And it's a very difficult thing for, I think, Australia to give consideration to, because historically our strength and our weakness has been our geographical sort of proximity. So that's kind of the high level view that I bring into this conversation, Ari.
Terrific. Yeah, no, thank you so much. Joni, would you build on this a little bit for me, this idea? And actually, before you do, I did a terrible job of housekeeping before we sort of kick things off. And Steve actually reminded me. So folks should definitely check out the handouts tab. A lot of cool stuff in there, to include a piece, TRM Insights piece on scams and fraud, crypto crime, sort of in Australia in particular, a TRM's response to a consultation, a whole bunch of other like sort of really cool stuff. And then also, please put questions in the chat. We will ask them. So please go ahead and do that. Joni, if you could sort of like talk a little bit about your work in the space, but also sort of this idea of public-private partnerships and really sort of how important they are here.
Sure. Well, I think the best place to start is, what is a crypto lawyer? And when I got into this space years ago now, I was an international tax lawyer by trade, but then we had ICOs and token generation events, and you had to understand regulatory, AML, CTF, as well as the securities laws. Then we had DeFi summer and the NFT boom, which got into more litigation, more IP laws, and more labor laws as people came in droves to sort of volunteer their contributions to be part of these really cool groups. And then we had DAOs, again, another compound on top of already brilliant technology, but making legal concepts a lot more complex to try to apply. And so when people ask, what is a crypto lawyer, you can't just answer necessarily that you know one legal domain, because you have to know a little bit about a lot of the domains. And it forces us all to have a better understanding of what the financial system is, why it's breaking, and then you very quickly get into matters of policy. So I do a mix of all of that in my job, in my day job, and one day is never the same as the next. But what I found when I talk to industry versus when I talk to governments and regulatory authorities is that the education gap is still so wide. And if there is not enough resources or funding or skills to have bespoke or special purpose virtual asset regulators or crypto token activities regulators, then I really like what Japan has done, where they've recognized these self-regulatory organizations, one that focuses on exchange activities, one that focuses on security token listings. And that really looks to be an effective way of bringing the private or industry best practice knowledge to bear in performing regulatory and supervisory functions in a nuanced public-private partnership, but PPPs are not new necessarily. It's just in this specific sector. So I'd love to see more of that.
Fantastic. Yeah, really sharp points, especially around sort of this crypto lawyer idea, right? I fight this all the time. Most people, when you talk about crypto policy, certainly in the US, it's defining, is it a security, is it a commodity? And it's really so much more than that. I also have to point out that you have the coolest name in legal services, right? Is it BADAS Legal?
Before I turned it into a law firm, it was BADAS, and now with the L, it's BADAS technically.
Okay. I was like super confused with some of the characters, but yeah, I mean, I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Brad, one of the things that Joni sort of mentioned was AML in particular, and obviously at TRM, that's sort of our major focus. Can you talk a little bit about the way sort of AUSTRAC has addressed AML, CFT in particular, as you're sort of thinking about regulating the ecosystem?
Yeah, and I was just thinking whether I can get myself a cool name like Joni.
We all need a cool name like that.
I don't know if that'll work for the regulator. The first aspect that I can really speak to is that sort of education, supervision activity that we have undertaken. And I think like any other industry that we regulate, we actually do spend more of our effort and more of our activity, I think, on that education piece than we do the other pointier ends of the stick of necessarily compliance. But what I can talk to as the sort of years have progressed in the last several years, we have certainly engaged in quite a bit more effort in understanding that 400 entities and who makes up those 400 businesses that we currently regulate. So we've been involved in undertaking surveys across necessarily that population and understanding their makeup, the types of products and services that they offer, and trying to understand in more detail the nature of the risks that they face. So we've also posed in Australia in our legislation each year we actually have businesses complete a compliance report, so they provide a whole lot of answers to a whole lot of questions that the regulator asks. So, and we've actually tailored some further questioning, particularly around the crypto sector, etc., to help us again further understand and sort of as it sort of goes to Joni's sort of thoughts about trying to get at that better understanding for ourselves, so we actually can make the right decisions and engage in the right manner that we can engage on. So I'm probably going to make some general observations perhaps, and I think that's the best way to go. And the first one is to probably say, like a whole lot of other industry sectors that we regulate, there is a whole lot of additional maturity, capacity, capability that the digital currency exchange sector continues to be on a journey on. And that's necessarily as I say, the course across a whole lot of different industry sectors that we regulate. So that's not completely foreign to people. I think what we have seen in probably the smaller end of town, I'm going to say, is sort of a more clear absence of the understanding of risk management and how to put risk management frameworks in place, delving into that understanding of risk. I think that's aspects, less reporting, which might be commensurate with the size of a business, but may also be related to that fact that they necessarily don't pick up the risks that they're seeing. In some other sort of medium-sized businesses, what we have seen, and again, this is not specific to the digital currency exchange sector, is that we see some outsourcing of different parts of the obligations. Again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's more about understanding that assurance over the top of whether that's operating or not, and whether that's actually effective, that you actually outsource part of your obligation to another business. The larger entities themselves, and I think we'll talk more about the public-private partnerships and what we do, but I think we've been trying to perhaps bring them closer into the tent on some of the ones that have that greater level of exposure, I think, to potential crime and money laundering. So that there has been that sort of engagement over the last year or two with AUSTRAC's public-private partnership, the Fintel Alliance, and we can certainly explore that a little bit more further.
Sorry, Ange, can I just add one thing on the AUSTRAC side, which is important to know outside of it? AUSTRAC's been showing up since we got into this space. It's been AUSTRAC's problem since I got here, and they've been inquisitive all the way through. And I think part of the problem that we face locally, which is not atypical, is the truth is when I dealt with regulators in 2017 and 18, AUSTRAC knew it was part of their problem, part of their remit, and everyone else largely said, this is not anything that we really need to worry too much about. That changed very quickly. And from a resourcing perspective, I think we continue to see the headaches that were an absence of resourcing within departments and an absence of education. And when I talk about education and people talk about the general notion that a rising tide lifts all boats, my joke is, well, you need a boat. Otherwise, the water just goes up and down. And part of the challenge has been people haven't had a sense that they need a boat in the water. And I think that's why we're struggling a little bit to get a sense of this cross-jurisdictional, cross-regulatory sense of what this space looks like. And it's not anything that is unique to us, but it's a real challenge, continues to be in my experience.
Thanks, Brad, Steve. I think as a former regulator myself, when you talk about education and resourcing, those are topics that are super close to my heart. And I think, even looking at 2018, that it's been 5 years. But, if we talk about the history of financial regulation and the history of financial services, that's actually an awfully short time for, an industry and a regulator to actually get to know each other. I think, one of the things that I found from my time at the Monetary Authority of Singapore is that, the crypto sector and regulators started off speaking quite different languages. And there has had to be that process of kind of mutual education and understanding, in terms of what are the expectations, what does it mean to operate a regulated business, and I think it's really super important to have that conversation doing, and for both sides to be open to receive as well as to give in terms of this educational journey. And Brad, just coming back to you, I wanted to kind of dig in a little bit to the financial crime aspect of it. When you look at your journey supervising DCEs in Australia, what are some of the top concerns in the area of financial crime? And from a partnership perspective, how can public and private sectors really work together to identify and fight this kind of illicit activity?
Yeah, thanks, Angela. And AUSTRAC's perhaps not an absolute unique position, but it's a relatively unique position in that we are both the anti-money laundering regulator, but we're also the Financial Intelligence Agency of Australia. So that sort of dual responsibility provides us with quite a lot or a greater visibility in relation to the risks that we face. And I probably wasn't necessarily going to sugarcoat this answer. There is plenty of crime. There is plenty of crime that relates to the use or misuse of cryptocurrencies or traditional criminal activities that then necessarily the placement, layering, and integration necessarily flows back through the use of cryptocurrencies, and that's across multiple different crime types, and it's sort of the nature of criminal activities means that the cryptocurrencies are necessarily just fall within another medium of use, I suppose, in terms of what may be able to be laundered or generated as a proceed and moved wherever it be, domestically or internationally. So AUSTRAC's certainly been involved on some fairly significant investigations, certainly with our law enforcement colleagues, intelligence colleagues, and regulatory colleagues. So more recently in 2023, a major investigation together with the Australian Federal Police that looked at a organised crime network in Australia. There was a myriad of other different commodities involved. There was shell companies, there was offshore structures, there was real estate, but there was also the element of cryptocurrency within that. Within the dark net, we've more recently worked again with a law enforcement agency in Australia where I think approximately $1.4 million of illicit drugs were actually purchased with cryptocurrency. So we get that sort of like the commodity purchase, etc. And I think Steve mentioned this earlier about community protection. Probably the biggest area of focus, I think, or a big area of focus is certainly scams and fraud, and the implications then of necessarily individuals being impacted by a scam, and the payments that are then being made are facilitated through crypto currencies and then moved wherever they might be moved in the world. So the National Anti-Scam Centre has been established in Australia, led by the ACCC, the Australian Competition Consumer Commission, for those who don't like to use too many acronyms. And so I think that's sort of, again, bridging a gap between government and industry, because there are both partners involved in those aspects. In terms of ourselves and in terms of our own public-private partnership, as I say, we have, for a period of time since 2017, had the FinTel Alliance in operation, has 29 partners that include both industry and law enforcement. Predominantly, those industry partners are the major financial institutions and some other major remittance businesses. But what we've actually done is actually branched out and established individual working groups. And in 2022, we established a virtual assets working group. Started off as a bit of a scoping with two major digital currency exchanges in Australia, and it is now a year later, I think has six digital currency exchanges and about 9 other major sort of law enforcement partners. And what that has led to, and what we attempt to do through the FinTel Alliance, is make information that we glean through those discussions available to the entire sector. So there's 2 public-facing documents that the FinTel Alliance has produced, one in relation to the misuse of digital currencies and the other in relation to ransomware. And they were actually generated on the back of that engagement through that virtual assets working groups in sort of 2022 into 23. And it continues to sort of build momentum in relation to better understanding the risk, better sharing from a law enforcement perspective to those digital currency exchanges that are involved, but then how we can then take that and sort of proliferate that more generally across the sector. So that they're the sort of the efforts that we're involved in, because as we've all said, we certainly don't know everything, and we don't necessarily know the technology behind it and how you can misuse it.
Terrific. Yeah, no, thank you so much for the answer. And I think you actually answered a couple questions that were asked in the chat as you were speaking, which is really cool. There are a whole bunch more for you around how does AUSTRAC monitor activity of a registered VASP, how AUSTRAC thinks about debanking, and then another one about sort of the use of blockchain intelligence. But I am going to let you rest for a moment and call on Joni and Steve here. Kind of similar question, but slightly different. Joni, let me start with you. Given sort of everything Brad sort of walked us through, right? Sort of the regulatory environment, how AUSTRAC is thinking about these things. How are you advising clients today? Like what, how are you talking about sort of engaging with this ecosystem?
Well, I'm sorry to say that the majority of my work is disputes and litigation at the moment. Yeah. At least coming out of Australia, there is not a lot of new prospects. So entrepreneurs that are, have a business idea and they want to do it from or headquarter it from Australia. So there have been projects that I advised in earlier years that have since moved offshore. And at that stage, it's working with the foreign lawyers to perhaps comply with MiCA or go through the VARA licensing regime in Dubai, or we're waiting with bated breath on the Abu Dhabi Global Market DLT Foundation regime, which is looking to be very promising. But it's that constant navigational exercise of not even month to month, but week to week on what is the most promising jurisdiction for regulatory certainty to give yourself a 1 to 2 year runway of building with some boundary lines that are likely to remain in that following period.
So let me stop you there and sort of build off that a little bit, because I think it's a really important point. Obviously, when you sort of look around the world, what are the sort of traits that sort of, obviously you see the rule books in the UAE and you see MiCA in Europe, and I get that it's sort of this comprehensive framework. It provides legal clarity, but I mean, what types of things would your clients like to see to obviously sort of continue to operate or engage, at home?
Well, on the customer side, so I have a lot of clients that have been affected by the Celsius, FTX, Terra Luna bankruptcies / failures. And from their perspective, they would love a regime in Australia that encourages Australian products or products that start Australian, that they can not only feel confident in investing in or participating in, but that if the worst were to happen, their rights are realised under an Australian legal system. Now, we know that the values that form other legal systems are not necessarily the same as Australia, and there's some awful outcomes coming, particularly out of the Celsius Chapter 11 process against Australian people that may have withdrew in that 3-month preference period before July last year when Celsius entered Chapter 11. In Australia, there would be a higher threshold where we actually look at whether that's a preference payment to people, that directors exercise some sort of special preference to allow that withdrawal. But we all know that people were led to believe that it was their tokens and they could withdraw at any time from the platform. And so for the bankruptcy trustee in the US to effectively say Celsius has the right for you to pay back all of the tokens that you withdrew in that 3-month period, and for that to be subject to US law, it feels unfair to Australians. So I would just encourage Treasury to get a move on and the Labor government with this custody and licensing regime that hopefully will encourage more Australian started or Australian made products. And then for what the other regimes are doing, I think I could pick a lot out of all of them. None of them are perfect. But what I really like about VARA and across all of their rulebooks is that they emphasize one of the overall expectations is that there is a professional culture of compliance. And that needs to pervade through all of the activities. It's not the responsibility of necessarily one director or one officer or one compliance officer. It's got to be a culture of compliance. And I think that's a really good takeaway for all around the world, not just Australia.
Terrific. I'm going to stick with this. I think it's really, really interesting. And I think that Steve and Angela both have unique perspectives here, just sort of with the time that either Angela, you're talking to regulators in APAC, Steve, you're everywhere, my man. What are the things as you're traveling, you're talking to policymakers? I think Joni really sort of started to dig into this. Talk to me a little bit about what you're hearing and maybe sort of what are the lessons to bring back to Australia.
Yeah, it's problematic. What Joni's touched on is the practical reality now over a long period of time, an absence of positive signals. And the fear of something going wrong overwhelms now any prospect of positivity here. And people look for signals from government and the top of government. And notwithstanding the fact that we recognise that regulators have a role, the primary role here is for government to say we are open-minded, genuinely tech agnostic with respect to this. What is the economic opportunity? Let's assess it on its merits. And those signals are largely absent from the local market. And it's interesting when people reflect on the previous government, there was no widespread commitment to this sector in the previous government. Hardly, if any at all, to be honest. There were a couple of voices that spoke to it. It wasn't widespread, but signals were periodically sort of shot up. The flares were shot up. And when you look at jurisdictions like Hong Kong that I've just come back from, they're very aggressively in market. They're promoting themselves as a destination for capital, a destination for businesses. And they're saying in the short to medium and longer term, they foresee digital assets of all descriptions playing a critical part in their economy. Those conversations are absent from the local jurisdiction. Singapore has been able to bifurcate conversations around blockchain, not crypto, and set their own path. Again, it might not be to everyone's liking, but there is a pathway that seems very obvious in Singapore for people. And as Joni mentioned, with VARA, the UAE, with the UK and the Prime Minister saying he wants to be a central hub again for financial services that includes stablecoins. All those things are signals. And I think where we've lacked in the last 6 to 12 months is a champion within government to say, we're at least going to talk about this subject matter in a way that says we're open to the possibility. And I think we're seeing now this downstream effect, which is, and I've never been one to say the sky is falling because it isn't, but businesses are now looking at a minimum at other jurisdictions. It's not necessarily there's an exodus and it's en masse, but to Joni's point, I speak to a lot of lawyers, Ari, and they all say to me that the conversation is not should you do it in Australia, the conversation is where should you do it? And at the moment, there is more consideration being given to jurisdictions which are a natural home for foreign direct investment like Singapore.
Angela, build on that. That's like right in your wheelhouse.
I think for me, it's really the theme of clarity and certainty, which is what Joni and Steve have been, alluding to as well. What I'm seeing across the region and really across the world is that the industry isn't looking for a shortcut. They aren't looking for light touch regulation. What they're looking for is clarity. They're looking for certainty. Because there are many players in the market, even just talking to folks at Token 2049, that, recognize the benefits of strong regulation, because we know that the crypto sector is facing somewhat a crisis of trust post 2022. So they recognize that strong regulation is important, but the industry also wants clarity on exactly what the expectations are. And, I think people have been positive on places like Singapore and Hong Kong because they can get that through policies that are forthcoming, as well as through engagements with the regulators and the policymakers. When they can get that, I think we've found that the industry has been quite willing to put in the work and engage. And the second thing, kind of building on that a little bit, is this idea of proportionality, right? When we apply the Financial Stability Board's principle of same risk, same activity, and same regulation, it has to be done in a thoughtful way. And this is where traditional finance and crypto, I think a lot of the same principles for good governance and compliance can be applied across both asset classes. But how that looks like in practice can be quite different. Just looking at a blockchain wallet versus a bank account, they're just completely different infrastructures. So while the law can be technology neutral, especially when we start to look at practical implementation details, it is important for us to be mindful of these kind of differences. And I think in our response to the Treasury's token mapping exercise, we discussed this at length. We really are hoping to see both clarity and proportionality as we move forward into the next phase of policymaking in Australia.
Terrific. No, thank you all three of you for sort of giving us that lens. Bradley, I'm going to sort of move back to you here and get maybe a little bit more granular based on some of the really interesting questions. And it's not surprising when you have a group of compliance professionals likely and folks in the space sort of looking to their regulator. Could you talk a little bit about sort of from a nuts and bolts perspective? I think how are you thinking about how are you thinking about licensing, supervision, sort of all of that?
First, I'd say aspects of licensing perhaps go beyond AUSTRAC's mandate, so that sort of sits in, and there are considerations by the Australian government, and certainly involvement with Treasury sort of leading those considerations around payments and licensing more broadly. And we're a part of those conversations in respect to that. But at the moment, our registration process stands, and we continue to facilitate. I would probably suggest the engagement of businesses to be registered. We'll certainly consider aspects around probity and capability, and we have probably increased perhaps our scrutiny on different businesses again over the last couple of years as we've spent more time regulating this sector, which I think is important. We want to keep necessarily the bad people out of the sector, just as we want to do that with other businesses as well. So that's an important aspect that we have a look at. And as I say, being both the regulator and the intelligence agency probably provides us with some elements, engagement with law enforcement to understand where there might be more concerns in relation to particular businesses, and we actually suspend and cancel and refuse the registrations of businesses, and all of that information is public on our website as to which businesses that has occurred to. Obviously, we're able to, from a more supervisory compliance perspective, and I think that was one of the questions that someone raised. I mean, certainly we'll monitor the reporting, which is necessarily an obligation for us in terms of suspicious matter reporting and the like. From a supervisory perspective, we'll actually engage directly with businesses and do otherwise traditional compliance, where we'll ask a whole lot of questions, get a whole lot of answers, and ask more questions and dig more deeply into particular aspects of our obligations around having an anti-money laundering program in place. What are the know your customer requirements that are in place? We'll test some of that, which is what we do with any business. So we'll test the nature of the different obligations that are necessary in place.
Yeah, Brad, I absolutely agree with you. The strength of a regulatory regime, is very closely tied into the implementation, the monitoring, and the enforcement. And funnily enough, in the last 2 weeks or so, we've actually seen quite high-profile enforcement actions in Singapore and Hong Kong as well. And I think it's this kind of ongoing efforts that really lend credibility to a supervisory regime. So definitely agree that it's really a key part of the puzzle, really.
Awesome. Brad, I'm going to stay with you for one more because I think this one's really in your sweet spot. And this may be one of my favorite questions ever. In fact, if you don't want to answer it, I will. Question for Mr. Brown. Does he have a view on whether crypto asset transactions traceability and public transaction records on public blockchains has assisted AUSTRAC in investigating fraud and financial crime, or in regulating fraud and financial crime?
Yeah, so one aspect of that, certainly we don't prosecute necessarily the money launderer per se. I'm going to say we absolutely use capabilities that are available to us to help in our tracing and tracking of transactions within the blockchain, and provide that information and intelligence to our law enforcement partners. So we are a key member of multiple different law enforcement intelligence task forces where we actually utilise those capabilities within our intelligence efforts.
The answer is yes. The native qualities of public blockchains, right? Transparent, traceable, immutable, allow for, trained law enforcement professionals, compliance regulators to, have more visibility on financial flows than we've ever had before. I think it's really sort of how do we take advantage of that technology. I was on a panel today at the Real World Asset Conference in New York talking about tokenization, and I said, look, like we keep asking for use cases. What are use cases for crypto? AML is a use case. It is not a bug, right? It is it's sort of a way we can actually harness the power of this technology. So really, really important. Joni, question in this chat for you as well, but I think it really goes to sort of how you're thinking about the space, and maybe a little bit to your last answer. Why have we not seen MiCA style, VARA style, comprehensive regulation in Australia?
I think because it is a very hard task. And Australia is not typically one to lead. They will fast follow. We say that our common law heritage and foundations are a feature, not a bug. So for things to move slowly is how Australia tends to like to do things, and watch and wait. And that's certainly what we're seeing here. But for those of my clients that do want to be those responsible innovators, they are not necessarily waiting for the Australian regulation to come out. They are asking the likes of me and other crypto lawyers to tell them what are the best bits of MiCA, of VARA, the draft bills going up and down in the US legislative processes. What are the best bits for them to form their policies and processes around and customer proposition, so that they can hit the ground running, maybe not from Australia, but perhaps a jurisdiction with more regulatory certainty. So for those that have runway left, or that have been able to raise, they are picking the best bits out of these jurisdictions and not waiting for Australia to pronounce what Australia's regime will be.
Steve, you want to get in here on this.
Oh, you know it, Ari. I really do. The problem for us was we were late to the party. The reality of we have a very conservative jurisdiction, which is, to Joni's point, often a great strength. We were late to this. VCs were late to this. Regulatory interest was late to this. We arrived, and then the party ended, and FTX and Terra Luna and all sorts of things sort of slowed lots of roles. What we're finding, and this is part of the narrative versus the reality, and we will often describe ourselves as fast followers. The point I make is we don't follow people who are fast, though. We're not following fast-moving jurisdictions. We're following those who are familiar to us, the United Kingdom, the US. They're not moving quickly. So when you follow fast someone who's not moving that quickly, by definition, you're in the back percentile. And that's where we find ourselves at the moment. The timing is everything, and momentum hard-earned is easily lost. And I think we just found ourselves sort of caught between those two environments, and we're seeing the implications now play out.
Thanks, Steve. And Joni, I just wanted to go back to something you said about responsible innovation and dig into that a little bit. We can't talk about innovation without talking about DeFi. And you do a lot of work in the DeFi space, looking at, DAO structures and the like, both Australia and globally. And I think, some of that legal discussion that you alluded to is also in the DeFi space. And, back here in Australia, the Treasury's recent token mapping paper, it talks about public token systems like DeFi protocols and how they do not map well to existing legal frameworks. So I know we're on a journey in Australia, but, if we were to look forward in the future, in an Australian context, how do you think we might look at regulation and risk management for DeFi?
Well, I actually really like the AMF, the Autoritari des Marchés Financiers out of France. They've put out a DeFi discussion paper recently, and globally, all of the regulators seem to have agreed that there's this same activity, same risk, same regulation approach. But what the AMF discussion paper has now put forward is that you start with same, but that allows you to identify the idiosyncrasies or the nuances of how a DeFi solution may actually have been reducing risk, such as the ability to track suspected money laundering, racket or group, or monetary flows and volumes in and out, and when that might be creating price risk or market risk or concentration risk. And so I really like their different way of articulating that same is still relevant. But when we're getting into technology that can bring us forward into the next era of digital financial market infrastructure and digital infrastructure that helps our everyday or business non-financial interactions that need to be trusted. So, my YouTube video, I might want to authenticate on the blockchain because I need to prove that it was me that said those things and not a deep fake AI that was saying this is the state of Australian regulation when it's not. So when we look to the same starting proposition, but to identify nuances and idiosyncrasies, that's where I think we really start to harness the benefits, both positive and reduction of risk that can bring us forward into a safer digital economy.
Joni, I'm going to stay with you there for a minute because there's a great question in the chat that I think goes to that answer. And this is what goes to the way you advise clients, I think. What steps could responsible innovators take now to prepare for whatever's coming, whether it's sort of a more MiCA-style centralized framework, or is it something in DeFi?
Well, it actually goes into something even more fundamental than legal principles. It's ethical. And the most basic exercise that any project can do is understand what is being offered, understand who is possibly going to interact with what is being offered, and then map sensitivities. So of those 5 different audience segmentations, which class is the most sensitive to a particular form of harm that could arise from this offering? And that's grounded in ethical principles. Do no harm. And so if you turn your mind to the different types of people that are exposed to the different types of harm, then you have a framework, the beginnings of a risk framework and legal compliance framework for the things that you need to prioritize and triage first, and maybe with some exercise of proportionality from regulators. But I think the trouble with that common sense ethical approach first is that projects with limited runways, particularly startups, they don't know if they prioritize AML/CTF but not securities law or tax, then what are the consequences to them? And then they feel paralyzed. So the proportional approach is great when you're looking at one particular regulator and supervising their legal domain. But for projects, they really struggle with the triaging and the proportionality across all of those legal domains. And like I said, as a crypto lawyer, we cover a lot of legal domains.
Yeah, it's a super nuanced, thoughtful answer. That was definitely real Joni, not deep fake Joni, because that was way too nuanced and thoughtful for AI, I think.
Yeah.
That was that was really good. Look, I mean, in defense of Australian regulators, right? No, there's no one, no country anywhere that is deep into sort of how to regulate in a truly decentralized space. And I think that becomes really a real challenge. We're still looking to intermediaries, even in places like Europe and Dubai and Singapore and Hong Kong. Steve.
I was just going to say, adding sort of an intersecting point here too, that a conference I ran recently, the regulators showed up en masse. Most regulators I've ever seen at an event. The challenge in the middle, when we talk about the chilling effect locally, it's very different to the chilling effect in the US conversation. In the chilling effect in the US, it often speaks to discouragement of businesses that are at the coalface that are trying to build. In Australia, the chilling effect is having an impact on traditional businesses, traditional financial service businesses, financial institutions, for fear of being caught in some slipstream, are absent from conversations. And I find myself having to really dull the language. And I've made a point more recently of saying it's okay to say the word crypto. It's not all bad. It's not all good. It's not all bad. You need to have a more sophisticated conversation. And what we're finding is much greater conservatism in traditional businesses who just don't want to mention it, because rather than being wayfinders and leading the way with respect to thought leadership or otherwise, their fear is that they're the canary in the coal mine and they're going to suffer for being the ones at the front of that conversation. So that's fairly and squarely on industry, not on government, not on regulators. And it's something which, I've seen a material deterioration in the last 6 or so months.
Terrific. Yeah, thank you. Staying kind of with some of the questions in the chat, Bradley, there's a question on sort of debanking. Can you talk a little bit about the work AUSTRAC has done in that space?
Yeah, and that question probably goes to exactly what sort of Steve mentioned there, and that's just the perhaps the risk lens is being placed on a whole lot of activity from across various different sectors, and crypto is not the only one that's necessarily has faced the elements around the account closures, debanking, de-risking, whichever terminology you wish to use. So, I mean, AUSTRAC itself, again, as the AML CTF regulator, has certainly put out position statements on our website. We've recently put out guidance in relation to dealing with high risk customers, which also then may necessarily refer to sort of higher risk industries in remittance, crypto, and others. They're not the only ones. So we have taken an approach, and will continue to take an approach where risk needs to be considered on its individual merits, on an individual basis, as opposed to necessarily a broad brush across industry sectors, and that's our position. There's been work that government and Treasury has also looked at, and I think the question that was there in the chat sort of goes to whether we're informed. We're not informed by in every different instance where an account closure might occur in relation to particular businesses, but we certainly have that understanding that it is occurring. So that's our position. Our position also for the businesses that are impacted is that a little bit like what Steve said is that we also have an expectation upon those businesses who may have a lower capacity, less capability, that they need to provide some insight in relation to what systems, processes that they have in place to provide a greater level of assurance to the banks that they're banking with, that they're actually doing the right things, and which means hopefully you find we get to a point in the middle that where there's less account closures occurring in a broad brush, and there's a greater uplift from the industry itself in terms of what our expectation is in terms of them having systems, processes, and understanding the risks that they face.
Terrific. Yeah, no, thank you so much. We are going to do a lightning round, but before we do, I have one more question for Joni. In particular, around like listening to Brad just now, there are things the industry could do and probably want to do, particularly around fraud and financial crime. Obviously AUSTRAC's focus here. What conversations do you have with sort of industry players, with clients, about things that they could be doing or are doing in the space?
Well, one of the most common things is trying to double use the chain forensics software. So instead of just looking for something that might be money laundering or terrorism financing, how can we extract those insights or that capability to identify market manipulation or market abuse and other behaviors that are captured under different laws, but from the same sort of technology approach or technology stack, so that there's not a whole new reinvestment from another technology project, but you build on the capabilities that you've already invested in and that you're familiar with. So it's more about getting more bang for your buck, I suppose. Yeah,
taking that kind of extra step. Look, it's interesting. I asked the question because I hear it more and more, even from industry. Like there are more things that we could be doing, and part of it is because that question around blockchain, right? You have more insight, more visibility. There are things that we can do. We run a website called Chain Abuse with some leading crypto firms. It's sort of like a Waze for crypto fraud and scams. It's a crowdsourced database where it's a way for the industry to police itself. I think there's probably a lot more we could be doing around our own data collection, referring to law enforcement, et cetera. But let's kick off a lightning round. Busting out the crystal ball. I think you're hopeful. I'm pretty sure you guys are hopeful on what may happen, hopefully over the next year or 18 months. Steve, what would you like to see? But like, let's not make this, rubbing the genie lamp here. Like, what's realistic?
Ari, I'm always hopeful. I always move towards a better.
I like that about you. I like that.
Yeah. But the reality is, I think we're going to slide. We'll slide locally. I mean, there's too much work that needs to be done in an asynchronous way, and there's not an appetite to do that work, is my honest view. When I see jurisdictions, again, I use Hong Kong as an example, they're just going to invest. And the thing that will get attention is Are people spending? Are regulators swinging their doors open? Are banks willing to talk to you? All of the puzzle pieces are in plain sight. So I think from a jurisdictional perspective, I think we will slide. But that doesn't say there's not more opportunity. I think what's happening is the region is opening up. And I think more of the world, given what's coming out of the US and with the SEC in particular, more of the world is focusing in APAC and saying these are jurisdictions that are willing to move more quickly because they are economically incentivized to do so in a way that other jurisdictions might not be. So more opportunity, but not necessarily a bigger slice of the pie here locally.
That was not hopeful, despite you promising.
It was. I smiled when I said it, Ari. It was hopeful.
Joni.
My wish is that we see a paradigm shift, and we're starting to see that a little because Australia has been targeted heavily around scams, and we've seen the Optus and the Medicare data breaches result in a lot of identity theft and a lot of loss. So my wish is that we start really valuing identity and forms of self-sovereign identity, as well as zero-knowledge proofs that help with risk profiling of a particular person as they're engaging with products, whether centralized or decentralized, and vice versa, so that you can risk profile a particular entity in a privacy-preserving manner. And I think that is actually the foundation that we need to get over. To Australians really value their privacy. So to see a big uptick for custody licensing regimes, FATF rules sort of becoming law in Australia, particularly the travel rule, I see that, privacy preserving identity tech and ZK proofs are perhaps one last competitive advantage that we may have left.
It's a great answer, and because it's sort of you address you acknowledge the problem, right? There AML, scams, fraud, etc. But there's a tech solution to it, and I think that all of that is being built today. And I don't think this is an Australia specific issue, right? This goes to every regulator in the world is sort of waiting for this. The U.S. Treasury put out a risk assessment, basically asking for these types of tools. So I think it's important. Angela, what are you looking forward to over the next year or so?
So C is for crypto and C is for clarity. I think, Australia is moving forward in its kind of policy making journey for the sector. And what I hope to see, I think in different areas, whether it's regulation or tax, is more clarity for businesses in Australia.
Terrific. And you always have to end with the regulator, because that's really who people want to hear from. So what could we possibly expect over the course of the next year or so?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we would like to see and certainly are keen to see from not only AUSTRAC but the broader Australian government is that sort of involvement in some of the reform processes that are in place. And I think from discussions with Steve and Joni, there's certainly the appetite to be there. That's certainly the case from the AML CTF considerations ourselves. We are looking to modernise the regime. We are looking to provide a greater amount of clarity, to use the word that Angela just mentioned in relation to the obligations. And if we can provide that sort of simplification of particular obligations, that benefits industry as much as it benefits us in terms of how we regulate. And if I probably go to the point that sort of Joni mentioned, I mean, the other element that perhaps we as both as a financial intelligence unit strive for is that businesses really do understand the role that they play in protecting the community, protecting their customers, and whether it's a bank or whether it's a digital currency exchange, you need to understand the risks that the services you provide can create, and look for the opportunities then to be involved in the process to protect those customers, to alert, to identify the types of methods, typologies that are actually impacting the business. That actually that's a positive, and I think if that can occur, the whole ecosystem benefits, and certainly the community benefits.
Thank you so much for that answer. So can I get a commitment to maybe come back in 6 months or a year and see if we're where we think we may be? We would love it. Love to have many, many more conversations about the work being done in Australia. Thank you so much for joining us today, and for just a really, really cool conversation on sort of the environment. So yeah, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. Please subscribe to our newsletter, the TRM Weekly Roundup. This is where you'll hear about what our next TRM Talks is, and sort of content on Australia and places all around the world. And stay tuned for more from TRM Talks. Thank you to an amazing panel. Thank you to everyone out there for helping us build a safer financial system.